أولا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إخواني وأخواتي، نرحب بكم ونعتذر عن التأخير. أوكي. طبعا الموضوع مهم جدا، الموضوع اليوم، وحقيقة يعني أنا من الناس اللي أحب هذا الموضوع، وهذا الموضوع حقيقة اللي هو موضوع المركزية واللامركزية من الموضوعات المهمة، واللي أعتقد أن يعني في مرحلة الآن في التعليم في المملكة العربية السعودية نحتاج هذه المرحلة وبقوة. الآن في إجراءات تعرفونها كثير الآن بدأت يعني تعمل بها المملكة، وخصوصا في التحول من المركزية للامركزية في التعليم. النقطة المهمة الآن اللي بنتحدث عنها الآن في قضية التحول هذا من المركزية للامركزية. اليوم بيقدمنا طبعا سعادة الدكتور أنتوني، وبقدم الآن السيفي حقت دكتور أنتوني، وهي سيرة حافلة بالخبرة والعمل. وحقيقة أن الجمع بين المجالين، المجال العملي والمجال التطبيقي، في هذا المجال يعتبر يعني الآن نعتبره عملة نادرة، أو أشخاص نادرين اللي يقدموا مثل هذه الخبرات. طبعا قبل ما نبدأ نحب نتكلم عن قضية مهمة في التحول من المركزية للامركزية، واللي مهمة جدا. من أهم يعني مثل ما ذكر مجموعة من الكتاب العالميين مثل ماك فولون ومثل كوين ومجموعة منهم، كانوا يتكلمون عن التدرج أو التحول من اللامركزية إلى اللامركزية من خلال مجموعة من العمليات، وقدموا مجموعة من الموديل، منها مثلا الراشنال موديل اللي هو المنطقة والعقلاني اللي في التحول اللامركزية. اسمحوا لي أقدم نبذة عن سعادة دكتور أنتوني. طبعا دكتور أنتوني هو بلجيكي الجنسية، ولكنه دولي الخبرة حقيقة، فهو عالمي الخبرة. طبعا من الأشياء اللي يتميز بها أنه يتكلم طبعا 3 لغات، يتحدث اللغة الإنجليزية واللغة الفرنسية واللغة الهولندية، وقريبا راح يتحدث اللغة العربية. طبعا هو يحمل شهادة دكتوراه في علم الاجتماع من معهد الدراسات والسياسات في فرنسا، وشهادة دكتوراه من معهد الدراسات والسياسات طبعا كانت بعنوان إشراف الدولة والمدرسة وتحليل علاقاتهما، وقدم نموذج للإصلاح في عام 2006. أيضا حصل على شهادة الماجستير في السياسات الاجتماعية والتخطيط من كلية الاقتصاد بلندن، وشهادة ماجستير في السياسات الاجتماعية والتخطيط في البلدان النامية، وهذه طبعا من من كلية الاقتصاد بلندن. وأيضا حصل على هذه الشهادة بامتياز. طبعا لديه الكثير من الشهادات. أنا استأذنت في قضية أني لن أطيل في قضية السياسات حتى نكسب الوقت، لكن البرنامج العملي منذ أكتوبر 2009، وهو متخصص في برامج وخبير في التخطيط التربوي والإدارة التربوية. طبعا من عام 1995 وهو متخصص في التخطيط في المعهد الدولي في باريس. طبعا هذا مشهور، المعهد التربوي للتخطيط التربوي في باريس. طبعا هو مستشار أيضا في التخطيط والإدارة التربوية، ومثل ما ذكرت لكم هو خبير في كثير من المعاهد. طبعا هو قاد مجموعة من البرامج في إقليمية، وقدم دورات محلية وعالمية. أيضا مثل المعهد الوطني للتخطيط في كثير وترأس كثير من الجلسات والمفاوضات. طب يعني قدم مهام كثيرة في كثير من الدول في بلدان أفريقيا وآسيا والجزر الكاريبي وأمريكا اللاتينية، وأيضا له نشر كثير من الكتب والمقالات حول موضوع المركزية واللامركزية. الآن محاضرنا طبعا الآن يقود الفريق المساعد الفني للتخطيط والقطاعات في المعهد الدولي للتخطيط التربوي، والآن يعمل في تطوير مشروعات وبرامج ومساعدات فنية لدول أعضاء للمعهد وشركاء تطوير، وأيضا كذلك في التمويل وتنفيذ بعض المشروعات. طبعا أيضا تنظيم دورات في اللامركزية في التربية وتحسين الإدارة المدرسية والإشراف المدرسي. أيضا يدرس في البرامج التدريبية المتقدمة سنويا في مستوى الماجستير للمجموعة الدولية. وأنا مثل ما ذكرت لكم سيرة حافلة وعطرة لسعادة الدكتور أنتوني. الآن نترك الفرصة لسعادة الدكتور أنتوني. أعرف بنفسي، أنا محمد المقبل، مدير عام التدريب والابتعاث في وزارة التربية والتعليم، وأدير الورشة. وأيضا يساعدنا الأستاذ محمد، الدكتور محمد اليامي، محمد السعد من إدارة تعليم نجران، وهو أحد القيادات الواعدة في الوزارة. الآن نترك الفرصة لسعادة الدكتور أنتوني، وأتمنى إن شاء الله أنها تكون رحلة علمية جميلة نستمتع فيها مع خبرة وتألق الدكتور أنتوني كعادته. أوكي.
شكرا. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for welcoming me here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you. I am sorry indeed that I do not speak Arabic. It would have been more pleasant and more interesting to discuss in Arabic. It's a language I appreciate, but unfortunately I've never had the chance to learn it. I will start from today. I've started actually once when I was a student, but I did not continue more than 10 or 15 classes. Maybe what I would like to do first is to explain a bit how I would like to proceed. This is a workshop, so it would be good if we can discuss at different moments. At the same time, there is a presentation that I've distributed. If we can use that presentation to structure our presentation and to structure our discussions, that would be very useful. So maybe what I will do first is I will start off with explaining a bit the different topics I would like to discuss, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we will see how we will proceed after the questions. I will give some of my input, some of my feedback, and then certainly at the end we will still have some time for further discussion. I will stand up most of the time, if you allow me. What I would like to do, the topic is a complex one, as we will see in a while, because decentralization itself is a term, we'll come back to it, which is relatively complex. And what I would have liked to do is to learn at the same time a bit from some theories, but in particular from the realities of a wide range of countries. Some of the more developed countries in the OECD, the example we heard from Singapore this morning was very interesting, and also countries in this region or in other Asian countries and so on. I would like to discuss a series of questions. The first two questions are quite straightforward, and these are the questions I would like to discuss with you. Namely, what do we consider to be decentralization? How do we define decentralization? And secondly, why do many countries these days want to move from centralization to decentralization, which is also the objective to a large extent here in Saudi Arabia? Subsequently, I want to look a little bit at when a country actually decides to implement decentralization, what are some of the challenges? We'll come back to that in more detail. And then what are some of the policy guidelines, some of the policy principles that we need to respect when we truly want to implement the policy of decentralization? So these are the four topics that I will try to look at. Let me maybe start with those first two questions. Let me start with the first one, and let me ask you, and also the participants in the other room, if you could give me what you consider to be a definition of decentralization. What do you consider to be decentralization? If somebody asks you, what is decentralization? Can you quickly tell me what you consider to be decentralization? I'll listen if necessary with this interpretation.
Like decision making in medium range administration and budget control and managing resources. It's more economical to be decentralized at the regional level. Okay.
And can you explain why it's more
It's in our country, it's a central budget, but it's more capable of supervising execution and allocation of funds, and it's in their advantage. You have they assist the what they are facing better than decentralized policy not tested.
Maybe we could say delegate plans and from the bottom school to up that lead to the strategic and policy plans in the future at the main. That let the school, plan. If we're talking about education, then autonomy, self-autonomy, and planning, and then gather all this information up to the bottom to up. Then you get this strategic planning.
My definition is almost close to him, as a delegating decision making and responsibility to a lower hierarchy.
This is really, when we talk, we're not talking about now the bottom and the regional comfort. It's on the other side, which is the central, in the last 40 years, has been involved in the smallest details of executions and medium plan. And this is what really we want to avoid, because in the central ministry or the center, they have a proper role for them, strategy and long-term plans and overseen things, which is now is what I call it's distorted, or
Actually, you have already responded to more than the first question in some cases, but we'll come back maybe to the second question still in a moment. I think on the issue of what is decentralization, even there, I thought your responses were very rich, because at the same time you discussed or you showed that decentralization will be different in function of the level to which we decentralize. Namely, we can decentralize from the central level to the province, or we can decentralize from the central level to the school, or we can do both. We can transfer some decisions to what we call generally the subnational level, the province or the region or the wilaya, or we can decentralize to the school level, which is not exactly the same. Secondly, you also have highlighted that actually what we decentralize can also be quite different. We can decentralize some administrative tasks, which is one thing. For instance, we can decide that teacher payment will be decentralized, while salary scales will still be set at national level. We can decentralize decisions, which is really quite different. We can go much further and say that, okay, a decision about, for instance, the curriculum can be to some extent taken at subnational level. Or we can decentralize also financial resources, which is still somewhat different. Let me go over this a bit more structured, and then I'll come to the second question. When I look at what is decentralization, I think the overall definition, which is a relatively straightforward one, is that it is really, and that is what some of you have said, the transfer of responsibilities from the central level to other actors. And we do not define yet, in this case, who are the other actors, neither what responsibilities we're discussing or we're talking about. But there are three key questions, and as we will see, actually the decentralization that different countries choose is quite different in function of those key questions. The first question is, to which level are responsibilities transferred? And they can go from the national level to the subnational level, the province or the district, or to the school. In Singapore, what we just heard, much is transferred to the school. This is partly because it's a very small country, and it's much easier to move directly from the national level to the school, but it's also because the schools have strong professionals. We'll come back to that. The schools have very strong principals, strong teachers, and as a result it is quite easy to transfer decisions to the school level. The same is true, for instance, in much of Australia actually, where you still have a national level, but then between the states in Australia and the schools, there is not much anymore of an, of an intermediate level. It goes almost directly, many decisions go almost directly to the school. In other countries that is not the case. Other countries have kept very strong sub-national levels. In much of France, for instance, there is very little school autonomy, but there is quite strong regional autonomy. So that's the first decision to take. A second decision to take is, now within those levels actually you could take two options. You could decide that you will transfer responsibilities to the education experts. In many countries that would be then the officials of the Ministry of Education, who may be at the central ministry or at a regional department or at a district department, whatever or provincial and so on, whatever the structure of your educational administration may be. You transfer to the educational experts because you feel that educational experts have really the expertise. They are the ones who are trained to take those decisions. But in some other countries, the reasoning is different. There the reasoning is that actually education is a very important issue for everybody. It's a very important issue for the parents. What sort of education I will offer, the country will offer to my children. It is very important also for policymakers and politicians. What content will I put in the curriculum? How long does my education system have to last? Some of the issues that were discussed already this morning by our key speaker this morning about how do we train our teachers, when do we do streaming? These are questions that are not only technical, they are also to some extent political. What content you put in the curriculum is a very political question. What language do you use to teach is sometimes a very important question. How do you make sure that everybody participates in education? These are political questions. And therefore, some countries feel that actually some of those decisions should at least partly be taken by people who are also, let's say, to some extent, political representatives. They may be elected, they may be nominated, but they are political representatives, or sometimes they may be representatives of the parents. For instance, in the USA, much of decision-making is taken, much decision-making on education is taken by what they call the school boards, which are in many cases responsible for more than one school. They are a local government. They can be responsible for 5 schools or even up to 5,000 schools. It depends a bit on the size of the size of the locality. The school board in New York, for instance, is of course much more important than the school board in some small village in Texas. And those school boards are elected. They have some professional experts who advise them, but they are elected, and many decisions are taken by those elected school boards. So that's a second option, and that's quite different. Either you opt for the educational expertise, or you opt for what you would call the political legitimacy. A third decision to take, which is a difficult one also, is what do we transfer? It was interesting because in your responses, you referred, for instance, to we can transfer instructions, we can transfer decisions, we can even transfer power. And this is quite different. In some countries, the only thing that has been transferred actually are administrative tasks. The central level should no longer deploy teachers. That should be done by the regional or the provincial level, because they are much better placed to do so. The central level should no longer, say, handle decisions on where the new schools will be constructed. That should be done by the provincial level or the regional level. But that are simply, let's say, administrative tasks that does not really transfer a lot of power. In other countries, there are really decisions that are transferred. You decide to allow, in some cases, even the schools can recruit their own teachers. The teachers are recruited directly by the schools. In the country where I was born originally, in Belgium, but also in the Netherlands, for instance, also in New Zealand and Australia, in South Africa, for instance, many schools, they recruit the teachers. And the teachers are under a contract with the school, though they are protected through national guidelines and national rules. You cannot just recruit anybody. And that, of course, is quite different from if you simply transfer some administrative tasks. Matrix, then you could make a distinction between 4 main models of decentralization. 4 main models of decentralization, and then 2 others which also to some extent are models of decentralization. I can decide that I will transfer decisions to the professional education experts at regional or local level. And that is what we tend to call deconcentration. What you're doing is simply people who used to be at the Ministry of Education, they are now to some extent at the regional education level. That is the option indeed, for instance, in France. This is what you find in much of South Asia. In Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in India, you will have this model. Deconcentration to a large extent. I can also decide to transfer responsibilities to, let's say, elected or nominated political representatives to a large extent. Again, at the regional or local level, and that is what we would tend to call then devolution. Some people consider this the real decentralization, devolution. I gave the example already of the US, which is a good example of devolution. You can look in a country to some extent in Vietnam, for instance, and then you can find other countries. In Africa, for instance, you have Uganda, which has such a model where you have local governments, and the local governments have their own little ministry of education, if you want to say so, a little ministry of education, and it's that local ministry which handles its education system. You have that, of course, almost in every federal state. Federal states such as Germany, such as Australia, such as Canada, such as Ethiopia, and so on. If you transfer resources and decisions to the school level, then you have again the same option. You could decide you will transfer decisions to the school principal, maybe the principal and senior teachers, and then we talk about school-based management. Or you could decide that no, at the school level you will have maybe a school management committee, a pupil-teacher association, a parent-teacher association, and those associations or committees or a school board, they have a majority of parent representatives on it, or local representatives, and then you could call this more school-based governance, because it's not anymore the education experts who take decisions, but it's the representatives of the parents who will take a majority of decisions.
What really, everybody knows that it's a necessity, okay? So what all the models all over the world, I think they all agree in maybe 4 things. As the level of education that they need, which is it's easy to detect, and that they all have to have a place to study, and it's by teachers, okay? And these are the cornerstones that rely on it. That's the other country experiences. How do they scale student gaining? If you decentralize on different models, there are scales to measure the education level.
In what sense? To measure the achievements of
Yes,
pupils?
yes.
Yes. We will come back to that in a moment also. Is your question about the linkage between the model and the student success?
Common thing, each of them. You have something common to look for.
Yes, there will be indeed. Yeah, I agree. But even then, there will be a number of decisions, indeed. A number of decisions will always remain central. Decisions about, for instance, decisions evidently about the length of your education system. You will have 5, 6 or 7 years of primary, 3, 4, 5 or 6 years of secondary, and so on. These decisions will remain central. It's decisions generally about expected teacher qualifications. This will remain central. A decision about the core curriculum will almost always remain central. And in quite some cases, but not always, national examinations will remain central. On the other hand, as I said already, I, for instance, come from a country, Belgium, where we do not have any national examination. The schools do their own examinations. And they can do as they want to a large extent for specific reasons. And I agree those are the elements that will always remain central. But once you go beyond those elements, then the questions come up. Who will decide on, for instance, which teachers to recruit? Who will decide on how to use specific financial resources? Who will decide on what textbooks to provide? In some countries, also, the level of, let's say, centralization of the curriculum can be very different. To come back, okay, Indonesia, for instance, in Indonesia, at something like 60 to 80% of the curriculum is central, and then the provinces can decide, and even to some extent the schools can add to that curriculum. So that makes indeed the scenario still a bit more complex. But we'll come back to some of those later. Let me just finish this little graph. So we have those different scenarios. There are 2 types of decentralization that I did not yet refer to as such, and I've put them there a little bit on the side. Many people consider them a form of decentralization, but they may be less important than the others. There is what we call delegation. You can decide that certain tasks, certain functions should not be undertaken by the ministry, but should be undertaken by a specific service which is separate from the ministry, but in many cases remains at central level. That is the case, for instance, for school supervision, school inspection, or school audits. In the UK, for instance, you have a separate unit in charge of school supervision, which is called the Office for Standards in Education. In many countries, examinations will be done separately. The reason is that it is considered that these are, how to say this, these are actually tasks where the decision maker should have some autonomy. If you really want to be able to inspect and supervise schools correctly, then you need some autonomy in doing that. You cannot belong to the administration, because if you belong to the administration, by supervising schools, to some extent you will supervise yourself also, because you are part of the school system. That's why in some countries there has been autonomy for these sort of units, and then we call these delegated services. And finally, of course, you have also a lot of private schools in some countries, and then we call that more privatization. So these are the different models of decentralization. Let me just ask, in Saudi Arabia, let me add to this also that in many countries you have a mixture. In many countries, and the point that was just raised was a relevant point, in many countries you have still some central decisions, you have some decisions transferred maybe to local education offices, some decisions transferred to schools, and maybe even still some delegation. So you will have a mixture of models. But still, some countries are much more in one model than in another. Now, in Saudi Arabia, what is the present situation if you look at this, and what is the policy objective?
But still we are in continuing process of decentralization. But it's what you warn us about is that it's through the administration. The administration of the school could have or affect the integrity of the scale of the students or the test or the level, because they are responsible about it. It's not delegated to someone outside. So because we still have this part of the ministry, you know. And that's why, to some extent, the skills achieved in the end of the general education is somehow doesn't meet the challenges and what we're looking for, especially when they will go to special colleges. And we feel that, and I know you are aware of it. And that's why we are discussing this thing, is that really to improve the general education through this, not one, but a mix of all of them.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
يمكن أوضح بعض النقاط اللي الحاضرين يعرفونها. ممكن تتلخص عملية اللامركزية في المملكة العربية السعودية في تفويض بعض المهام الإدارية، ويعني كان آخرها تفويض مدير المدرسة تقريبا 52 صلاحية إدارية. أما بالنسبة للمنهج، المنهج يعتبر مركزي يوزع على المدارس وتحقيق أهداف التعليم بشكل عام. النواحي المالية كذلك لا يوجد تفويض صلاحية، تعتبر مركزية، فينحصر تقريبا تفويض الصلاحية على المهام الإدارية داخل المدرسة، ويكون التمايز محدود بين المدارس. طيب شكرا.
Still here we'll find out in current status in Saudi Arabia, which still have centralized mostly. There is through the Tatweer, which is King Abdullah project. There is through the project, the national project, there is a pilot study, which is pilot projects now. Some of the schools, they try to decentralize them. But actually, like if you look at the whole system, still there is centralized. there is some delegation, which is the regular delegation that given to any principal and any school, which is not up to the decentralization that international that I think, and here is a question now, maybe allow me to ask, how are you gonna have equity whereas and in decentralization, whereas there is no level in like to be principals and schools in the same level in the one line, and then you go up and trigger central decentralization of some factors. So you need equity first as infrastructure and the environment to be in the whole country. Then you go up to trigger decentralization.
Okay, I'll come back to that. That's an important point. But thanks for the 3 replies. I think the situation of Saudi Arabia is, from that point of view, not really exceptional. It's a situation which you find in many countries in this region, and even still in quite a number of OECD countries, where there is a trend to decentralize, but at the same time a certain hesitation for the reason that you've explained already, the issue of equity. And we'll come back to that, how you can, because I think it's a very important question, how can you implement decentralization while maybe keeping some centralization, so that precisely equity does not suffer. And that will be one of the issues we'll come back to. But that has clarified that indeed there is, at the moment, there are different trends. Schools have some authority, but it's more administrative authority than very much decision making, and there is a trend towards a strengthening of the provincial offices. If I continue still, but that I won't spend much time on this, people also make a distinction from time to time between political decentralization, where you really transfer political decisions, financial decentralization, where you transfer financial resources, and then more administrative decentralization, where you transfer administrative tasks. And I think from what our colleague said, at the moment we are more here in a context of administrative decentralization and maybe some financial decentralization. Let me ask my second question then, to which some of you already gave some responses, but maybe we can focus on it now more specifically. Namely, why is there a need to decentralize? You gave already some of those answers, but you can maybe repeat them now if necessary. Why do you feel that, why does Saudi Arabia want to decentralize its educational planning, management, administration, decision making?
First, quality. Second is to put aside, guarantee to put aside threats to discontinue education through less budgeting or anything like that. Because in the old days, when we have schools, it's funded by the people, the locals, which is guarantee that it will continue. Right now, everything is central. Anything can affect the quality and quantity. The country is very big, and it should really rely on decentralization and funding, for this oil revenue is not all the time. Everybody knows about it. So we want our country, not today, but hundreds of years, to stand rigid, not depends on, okay, today you give us $1 billion, tomorrow you give us $5 billion, the day after you will give us $500 million, okay, which is not acceptable if you want a real continuous steady education. Okay.
This is very interesting. Let me just ask a question. For the first point you said, we introduce decentralization because we want more quality. But how do you think that decentralization will contribute to quality?
Because if you give them as temporary basis, you distribute the budgeting or the fund for them, it's very easy with some of the things that you delegated or it's centralized, that you really make them to compete to each other regions, okay, and try to value them regularly. This is better than just a central decision for anything, you know, around the education, which is not been implemented, you know, most of the time.
Yes, thanks. We'll come back to that in a moment, because the linkage between decentralization and quality is, as you said yourself, not a direct one. It's not as if automatically because you decentralize there will be better quality. But we'll come back to that. It is possible, but sometimes actually some countries have decentralized and quality in certain parts of the country has suffered. We'll come back to that. Yeah. But yes. Maybe the gentleman, well, still on the question of why do we decentralize? The gentleman here and maybe in the other room also? No?
أنا في تصور الحقيقة أنه حتى نصل إلى الجودة في تفويض السلطة أنه يتم ذلك عن طريق هندسة العمليات الذي ما يسمى في الجودة بالهندرة، وهي تخفيف الهدر، وهذا ما لن يتم إلا إذا كان هناك توافق والبيئات المختلفة اللي هي من تنطلق من الموارد المادية والبشرية.
Yeah, I agree with this, but actually you are going one step further already, because what you are, and this is very useful, but we'll come back to it, is you are already going into the question, how can we successfully implement decentralization? We will need clear coordination, we will need clarity about the roles and the tasks of the different levels and the different actors. But my question is still, why do we decentralize? Okay, we have said decentralization could lead to better quality. Decentralization, you also said, could lead to more resources. By decentralizing, maybe we will collect more resources. What could be other reasons?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم. سرعة إنجاز العمل، اتخاذ القرار، سرعة حل المشكلات التي تعترض التعليم، سرعة تطور التعليم.
Actually, I will be more specific. Yeah, why we need centralization? Because the faster process. Also, we need to make faster decision or accountability. Also, we need more minds, which is we need not the power from one thinker. We need more minds from more thinkers. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe indeed. I think the points that are raised are also the points I had more or less on my slide. There are quite a number of different arguments in favor of decentralization. When you read the literature on decentralization, you will find different arguments, and I've tried to summarize these in the following graph. So I think you will find differences, but I think the 4 points that I've raised here are probably the most important. The first one is what was just said by our colleague, namely we will have faster, or what we could say more efficient decision making. If a problem occurs at the school, you do not need to wait until the ministry has approved the decision you want to take. The principal, the head teacher can take the decision immediately. In the province, you do not every time need to ask the central ministry for approval. You can take those decisions yourself. So it's more efficient. A second point that is raised regularly is that it is also more relevant. I work in a province, let's say. I know my province well. I know my province better than the person in the Ministry of Education who does not know my province as well as I do. So if there is a problem, I probably know better the nature of the problem. I probably know better how to address that problem than the person in the ministry. In a school, if there is a problem in a specific school, I again as principal, I know my school, I will know better how to address this problem or what policies my school needs and so on. So that's what we call greater relevance. It's more relevant to allow the decisions to be made by the people at local level because they are more aware of the situation at local level. The third one is the point also that was just raised, namely, we have more people involved. We have more minds thinking about education. As a result, we may have richer decisions and the participation will also actually lead to greater, let's say, greater awareness of education and maybe greater contributions, not simply financial, but a greater contribution to education as you know, a social and a public good. Let me give an example. I discussed with somebody who was the Director General of the Ministry of Education in New Zealand 10-15 years ago, when New Zealand created in each school what they call the school management board, the school governing board. That school governing board was 10 or 12 people, depending a bit on the size of the school, elected by the local community, elected by the parents, and the school board could take decisions about the recruitment of the principal, and then together with the principal they recruited the teachers, they had a budget for teacher development, for instance, for student support and so on. And it was a lady actually, the Director General, she told me that when that was introduced there were problems, for sure, and indeed the problem of equity had been raised, because you have a small minority in New Zealand, the Maoris, who are the original New Zealand people, who had quite some difficulties. But at the same time, she said, by introducing these school boards, suddenly, I think there were about 7,000 schools in New Zealand, it's not a very big country, suddenly we had something like 80,000 people who participated in decision makings on education almost every day to some, I mean not every day, but very regularly. And as a result, you suddenly had all of these people who were not only taking decisions, but also being better informed about education, being more committed. And let me just go back a little bit. So I was given the example of New Zealand, where indeed by creating school management boards, and on each school management board you had 10 or 12 people participating, suddenly you had so many thousands of people who were suddenly quite involved in educational decision making, and that created, let's say, a great interest, that created also more commitment, more awareness and so on. And as a result, it was a policy you could never go back. People had gained that interest in education and were happy with the decisions they could make, and as a result the government actually could never go back. They could not decide we're going to abolish the school management boards. At the same time, you have to be a bit careful, because there are other countries where they have tried to do that and where either there was not sufficient interest in the communities, and it was difficult to find people who wanted to be members of such boards, or there was not, or within the community, it was always the one or two already very strong leaders who were given all the responsibilities. We'll come back to that. Fourth, we could argue in favor of decentralization is that through decentralization you have a more direct accountability. Let me explain a bit. Imagine two situations. Situation one, I'm a principal of a school and I cannot decide about the teachers I want in my school. The teachers are sent to me by the central government. I do not have much, I don't have a budget to run my school with. I cannot really play much of a role in promoting a teacher or giving them additional incentives. And I don't have any control over the curriculum or the textbooks. If my school does not function well, if I have bad results, and the parents come to me and they say, your school has bad results, how will I respond? What will I say? Indeed, I will say, it's not my fault. I do not control anything. The teachers are not good, but I didn't decide on them. The teachers, I want to get rid of teachers, I cannot. I don't have any money to invest in additional teacher training and so on and so forth. So in that way, I can to some extent escape my responsibility. On the other hand, imagine situation two, the situation now for instance in Singapore and in quite some other countries. I am a principal. I recruit to some extent my teachers, or at least I have a say in which teachers will come to my school. I have a budget to use for the school's improvement. I can decide if I'm going to use this budget for buying computer or for giving teacher training or for special programs for student support. I can hardly say to the parents, it's not my fault, because now it's not anymore out of my hands, it's really in my hands. So that's what we call more direct accountability. At the same time, I think we have to, so these are four good arguments for decentralization. At the same time, it is true that in many cases, when countries have introduced decentralization, actually, those arguments were not the most important. They've introduced decentralization sometimes for political reasons, to satisfy demands for regional autonomy, for instance. That will start again. So these are some of the factors that explain why decentralization does not automatically will lead to success and will not automatically lead to greater efficiency, greater relevance. The fact that resources and assets in a country, in any country, is unequally distributed, that there are some villages, some school boards, some councils, some provinces who have many more resources and assets than others, and this is the case in almost every country in the world. The Scandinavian countries are a bit of an exception, and indeed small countries such as Singapore, Hong Kong are also somewhat of an exception. The fact that when you decentralize, you need to build professionalism, I'll come back to that. You need to pay attention to the distribution of power, and we need to think about the levels and fields of autonomy. Let me go a little bit more in detail on two factors that I think are particularly complex to address. The first one is that when, and this was again very clearly said this morning in the presentation on Singapore, when we give more autonomy to, be it the schools, be it the provinces, be it the districts, be it the villages, the wilayas and so on, we also need to strengthen the support system. But what we see in many countries is that this is not always the case, and there are four factors that I would like to look at fairly quickly, because I think the point is relatively clear. The first one is that actually when we distribute resources, here I'm not sure this is such a big problem maybe in Saudi Arabia, but in other countries it certainly has been a problem, is that the resources we allocate are insufficient. That obviously is a problem when you are in a relatively poor country. In Singapore, let us not forget that in order to be able to do all of the decentralization, you have to have a very good economic development. And it's the economic development that has allowed to some extent to distribute more resources to the schools. But even if resources are enough, there can still be a problem with the way we distribute resources. I don't know how it is in Saudi Arabia, but a number of countries, we will distribute, for instance, to each province or each school more or less the same amount of resources. How are resources distributed here? Yes. The number of students. Indeed, and that's an important point.
For education, but for buildings, by the number of buildings.
Okay. So it's the number of students, the number of buildings. That's okay. The number of students, the number of buildings. Then again, some people will say, yes, but not all students are the same. Some students, they may need more support than others. But it's difficult to know on what basis you will decide that. Some students who, for instance, here I'm not sure what would be good examples, but in other countries, in France, let me take the example of France. In France, a student whose parents are recent immigrants. You know, in France we have many immigrants from Mali, Senegal, Chad, Niger, and so on. A student whose parents are recent immigrants, they need more support from the school because the parents cannot give that support. And therefore, indeed, in France, in principle, schools where there are students with schools where there are many students who are recent immigrants, they will get more support than other schools. In France also, they will look, for instance, at the profile of the teachers. A school where the teachers are either not well qualified or very unexperienced, because they're relatively new teachers, will get more support from the inspection, let's say, than a school where you have very well qualified teachers who have a lot of experience, because indeed, why is it doing better? Which one is using resources more efficiently? Which one is making decisions in a more, I don't know, creative manner? And the same with schools. We will maybe compare a little bit between schools on the basis of their results, but we will not try to draw conclusions from that, so that other schools can learn from the success of those schools. So, in many cases, the monitoring structures are relatively weak. And indeed, successful systems, and again, the Singapore example was a good example, are systems which do regular monitoring, but then, and this is maybe even more important, in function of the monitoring, we also need to act. We need to provide technical assistance and capacity development. I'll come back to those issues a little bit later. And there again, with technical assistance, what do I mean? For instance, we provide, as we said already, we provide autonomy, say, to schools. And we provide, for instance, or we ask each school, as many countries do now, to prepare a school improvement plan. A plan where the school, the principal, the teachers, they will sit together and they will discuss together how can we improve our school. But many principals find that a difficult exercise. It is not that easy to bring your teachers together, to discuss together, okay, what are we doing well? What are we doing not so well? Where do we need to improve? Where have we already made a lot of progress? What can we together change in our school to make the school function better? And a bit unfortunately, what we have seen in a number of countries is that, okay, we ask schools to prepare school improvement plans, but when they cannot do it, we don't provide them any technical assistance. We may provide maybe some guidelines, but ideally, what we should have is somewhere a little team, maybe in a district at the wilaya or so, a little team that can go to the school and help the school if necessary. That a principal can say, excuse me, but I need some support. And that we can send a little team to the school to work with the school to help them do the school improvement plan. Equally important is then the wider field of capacity development, that really we try to strengthen capacities at the local level. I will come back to that. Yes, sir.
Technical assistant, this will be more handy when you have remote education through internet, you know, special classes for the instructors, you know, from the central or from another region. It will be more handy for this.
Yes, I think that's a very, very good point indeed. If we are in an environment where the schools are connected through the internet to either the wilaya or the province or whichever, maybe even a teacher training institute or a management institute and so on, if we are in such an environment, then indeed we could imagine that there is something like almost like a hotline. As they say, if I have a problem, okay, I can try to reach out. From time to time, I still think that from time to time you will still need, it still will be good in some cases to send an actual team to a school, 2 or 3 people, and to sit down with the school for maybe a day or 2 days and to really help the school. It depends on the nature of the challenge that the school experiences. But I agree that certainly this becomes easier to handle now with the new technologies. And this is something that maybe we need to think about, something that maybe we do not sufficiently develop. Okay, but it's something that indeed probably is possible indeed at basic education level. Thank you.
Trigger change. If you have anything about education process, this comes to help us. Now that's what happened now in the 5 projects with about 100 schools, and merge the technology to having a portal and dealing with all of that.
Okay. Yeah. And I think it's important. At the same time, I think that also, I mean, some schools, how to say, to transform a school, to improve a school is not a simple exercise. If a school has difficulties, the relationships between the teachers are not very good, the relationship between the principal and the teachers are not very good, the parents feel that the school is not doing very well, you may need more than a help desk or a hotline. That can, I mean, the help desk and the hotline remain very useful, but you may need more. You may need really 2 or 3 people who are what you could call school support actors, who come down to the school, sit down with the school, discuss with the principal and the teachers together, ask them, okay, why is the school not performing well? What are the problems you experience? Why have your results not improved? Why do the parents want to go away from the school? And really work with them, maybe sometimes over a year, 2-year, 3-year period, by regular activities that they do together, and really develop together a school improvement plan and implement together that school improvement plan. So you will still need that, but at the same time I fully agree that having also, maybe for what are sometimes more administrative problems, having a hotline, a help desk, whatever, somebody who can quickly respond to your problem is very important. I have discussed with quite a number of principals, and one of the frustrations that they experience is that when they ask for advice or support, or when they send a report to the district level, to the wilaya or to the provincial office, and they never get any feedback, and that is very frustrating. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I think culture of decentralization must be implemented into society and schools, because you're talking about a different concept where society and decentralization will work as a monitor and as a shareholder.
Yes, yes. The point is very well taken, and I'll come back to that in the next slide a little bit. Namely, that it's also indeed a matter a little bit of culture. As I said a little while ago, if as a school administrator I have always implemented the decisions that somebody else took for me, and I never had much creativity in taking decisions, then of course I'm used to that sort of decision making. And if suddenly I'm being told, oh, but now you get a budget and you can do with it what you want, I will be afraid. I will be afraid because this will be a rather sudden shock. So there is also a culture, and a culture on both sides. There is a need, in many cases, for the local people to take responsibility, to dare to act, to dare to take initiatives, but there is also a need at the central level to allow people to take decisions, to allow certain decisions to be out of their hands. Decisions about teacher recruitment in many countries remain very centralized because these are decisions that people like to take, because if you decide about recruitment, you have a lot of power. If I can recruit, if I can decide who will become teachers or who will become administrators, that gives me a lot of power, gives me a lot of authority, and sharing that is not always that easy. Another, so still in challenges, and that that is related to some extent to the last point that was raised. There are also, when we actually, in the institute where I work, we did a lot of research on how local education offices function in some African countries, in some Asian countries, but even still in some Latin American countries, and even still in some OECD countries. And when you go in a number of countries to a local education office, or when you go to a school, actually you still see many difficulties related to, let's say, the functioning of these offices or the functioning of these schools. The first problem is one that is well known, namely, in many cases, the capacities to implement the reforms are relatively weak. We do not necessarily have in the local offices people who have the professional profile that we would expect from them to take decisions, to be proactive, to be strongly motivated, and so on. But that can be changed, and that should be changed. I think there are three other factors that are quite important, though. Secondly, in order to really, suppose that I am working in, say, let's take the example of a wilaya, a district education office. And I'm being told, okay, you need to define a plan for the development of your district. Okay, I can do that, but do I have all the information that I need to be able to do that? Do I know what are the strengths and the weaknesses of my district compared to other districts? Where do I perform well? Where am I not performing so well compared to other districts or compared to the national level? Have I made progress in certain areas, or have I not made progress in other areas? How does my performance compare to what the government expects me to achieve? How does, and in addition, once I know what are my strengths and weaknesses, do I actually know how to overcome those? So in many cases, what can be missing is that sort of quality information. It's not only information about the quality, but the information itself has to be sufficiently rich for me to take decisions. It is not sufficient. In a school, this is even more important to some extent. It's not sufficient for a school to know that its results are not good. Generally, the schools know that. Generally, a principal knows my school is not doing well. What the principal needs is, why is it not doing well? Where am I not doing well compared to other schools? Where am I not doing well compared to 5 years ago? And what can I do about it, and what can my teachers do about it? And that information is not necessarily available. Another difficult point is the issue of accountability. Again, let's continue with the example of the district education officer, who is given some responsibilities. But if I'm not performing well, will actually will there be any action taken on the fact that I'm not performing well? That action could be, if necessary, sanctions, or it could be more support. Maybe I'm not functioning well because I simply don't get enough support. I haven't had a chance to be trained for 2, 3, 4 years, or I'm not sure about the activities I should undertake. So there may not be very strong accountability, and sometimes it's also that at school level we may say that, okay, the principal will have to be partly accountable to the local community. In a lot of countries, the principal has to prepare a report now on the school's performance, which will present it to the local community. But the local community does not have the authority to take any action with regard to this principal. The principal may not be performing very well, but the local community cannot take any action. So there's also there some ineffective accountability. And the result is that actually in many schools, in many local education offices, we cannot really talk much about strategic planning. You know, strategic planning is the whole idea that, okay, I examine my situation, I try to identify what are my strengths, my weaknesses, what are the areas where I need to improve, the areas where I am already strong, and on that basis I will define my improvement plan. And then together with my teachers, or together with my administrators, together with my staff, I will develop a plan to achieve that improvement. But it's not, I mean, this is not something that happens in one day. This is something that takes time, and for that you need to have the capacities. You need to have the information so that you know what action to take. But you also need to have strong accountability so that if you succeed, you get some form of reward, not necessarily financial reward, but let's say recognition. And if you do not succeed, you either get some form of sanction or maybe additional support.
I wonder, you know, who is responsible for, in the national level, not even inside the ministry, which we call the central, who set the main criterias for the education? Because when you say here quality information relating to other schools or other regions, and I compare my performance to these levels, I imagine that the main battle inside the ministry now is really to set what we are looking for, the main criteria for education. What exactly the education? Okay, if this is agreed upon on the national level, then anything go with the decentralization will be successful and measurable. You can measure it, you can develop for it. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, it's quite evident. I mean, there are two areas there. Right? There is who takes decisions about national policy objectives, national policy objectives and expectations, national outcomes. That is the national government. I mean, this is that is the national government. And different processes may be there. In some cases, this may be a very participatory process. You may organize, and I'm quite sure that happens, national conferences where you discuss and so on and so forth. But major decisions about national policy, what do we expect our education system to achieve, these are very much policy decisions, political decisions, and this will be done at central level by the national ministry, maybe, I mean, ministry and government, because it's really a political decisions, maybe in consultation, through participation, through dialogue, through negotiation, whatever. But it is finally a national decision. Then there is a second question. Now, how do we make sure that those policy objectives are respected and that our outcomes are achieved? And therefore, you need good information. And in many countries, and I would imagine it's the same in Saudi Arabia, in many countries we actually do collect a lot of information on education. We do a lot of data collection. We have school census every year. We have many reports that schools have to prepare, reports that district education officers have to prepare. We check on pupil absenteeism, pupil presence, and so on and so forth. When I was a teacher, the first thing I did when I entered in the class, I've been a teacher for a number of years, the first thing I did when I entered the class was to take my roll call. Are all the students here? And I noted that down, and in my school, we knew always how many students were present, how many students were absent, and so on and so forth. We do collect a lot of information, but actually, somewhat strangely enough, that information is used mainly for administrative purposes, to pay teachers, to see how many teachers to recruit, to see when new buildings have to be built. But we don't really use it for what you could say system management. I don't think so. In many countries, we don't use that information to transform it into knowledge for the system. We do not necessarily know which district is performing better than which district. We do not necessarily know that particular school, what are the exact problems it experiences, while in principle, the information we have available would allow us to do it. Okay? Now, let me come to the last part, because we are a little late. I've taken a bit more time, but the discussion was good, I think. And so what I would like to look at now is a few slides on how to construct a policy of decentralization. Some of the things will be a reminder of some issues that I already mentioned. At the same time, as you will have noticed, a discussion on decentralization is always a relatively lengthy and complex discussion, because it is a complex matter. And so what I'm going to say here is just a few key points, but afterwards I think I send a few texts that could be distributed. I'm not sure, maybe they're there. If not, okay, if they're there, so much better. And there are still other texts that, if necessary, I can send to the organizers and that I can share with you. Firstly, a few key principles. I think when thinking about centralization, decentralization, some countries at the moment are re-centralizing because they feel that there was too much decentralization. Or at least they are re-centralizing some tasks. The task of control, for instance. Control, not only financial, but especially pedagogical control, has become, in many cases, re-centralized, with a stronger control at central level. And to a large extent, finding the right level of centralization, decentralization, is really a matter of keeping a few balances, or a few scales in balance. But what will be the right balance will change from country to country and may even change within a country. I'll explain that in a moment. The first balance is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, education is certainly to some extent a technical exercise, calculating education indicators, preparing an education plan, even deciding on the number of teachers to be recruited or the profile of those teachers, developing a curriculum. These are very much technical tasks. Not everybody can do that. On the other hand, education is also very much a political field. What are the values that we want to transmit through our education system? What is the language we want our children to, the language or languages we want our children to acquire? How many of our children do we want to get into university, for instance? How many do we want to get into technical education? And so on and so forth. These are very much political decisions, and therefore we need to keep a certain balance between the technical expertise and the sort of more political legitimacy. Yes, sir. But just a second, so you have to use the microphone so that my interpreter can translate.
Put your finger in the wound to heal it. This is the main really issue that we are facing in the last especially 5 years, that all high school graduate, they all tend to go to college with no true identity. They don't know what to do, and they are just such a national waste. Nobody say that maybe 25% of them should go to college. And that's really a problem. That it's what do you call it? Political legitimacy, like the language, like other things. Thank you.
No, I think that's it's a big problem in many countries, but it's not something we can discuss now here. But it's a big problem in many countries that the demand for university is actually not at all in relationship to the number of jobs that university graduates can acquire. The problem, I mean, the disconnection between the education system and the economy is a serious problem in many countries. And it's difficult to change. It's difficult to change because many parents and many students prefer a university education, even if actually there is sufficient proof to say that that university education will not give them better chances in the job market than, say, a good professional degree. It's the same in almost every country, and it's not easy to address, and it's really not easy to address. I'm not sure you can blame the education system. It's also partly the economy. The economy, if the economy does not offer enough jobs, there is little that the education system can do. And it is very difficult for any government to limit access to university education. Because people will almost always feel, I mean, parents will get angry and students will get angry. Then again, it is a real time bomb if you have many university graduates who do not have a job. I mean, the revolution in Tunisia was mainly caused because of that. A wide range of university graduates who do not have access to the job market. But it's a topic I don't really want to enter into now because it's worth another 3 hours of discussion, and I'm already a minute late, I think. So, but it is an important issue. But you are right, it's related to there somewhere that balance between, as a technical education expert, we would say, oh, as you say, let us limit access to university to 15%, 20% of secondary school graduates, or maybe 25% of secondary school graduates. But if I'm a minister of education, or I cannot do that because politically it's almost impossible to do. And you cannot blame the politicians to take decisions which are politically justified. But okay, that's a different issue. The second balance we have to take into account is the balance between local autonomy and central regulation. You will, in every system, you have some central regulation about, for instance, the content of the curriculum, about the qualifications expected from teachers, about the achievement levels you expect from students, and so on and so forth. And actually, let's say, how to say this, the more effective your central regulation is, the easier it is to give local autonomy. Because if your central regulation is well done, then you can give local autonomy, because the local autonomy will always respect central regulation. That is why many authors argue, 5 minutes. That's why many authors argue that in order to have good decentralization, you need a strong center. But a strong center is also a center that is willing to share power. It is not strong in the sense of control-oriented. It is strong in the sense of effective and confident. Third point that is very important is that we need to keep into account the balance between the mandate in the sense of the tasks, the functions that we assign to professionals, and their resources, their assets, their competencies. To give an example, if I give schools a budget, a block grant that they can use to recruit teachers, to pay teachers, to provide teacher training, to maybe take care of my buildings and to buy equipment, as some countries do. If I give that to a principal who has never had any training in financial management, who is not very well qualified, who belongs to a who belongs to a family, and the pressure of the family to recruit people from within the family is very strong, in such a context, there is a real risk. In such a context, there is a real risk that the principal will abuse of that authority. Maybe because of, I don't have any financial management skills, so I will not know how to use this money. I want to recruit teachers. Well, my cousin comes to see me, my nephew comes to see me, my mother's uncle comes to see me, and I have to recruit this one, I have to recruit that one. And I have some money for training my teachers, but I don't really know very well what is the best way of training my teachers. In such a way, actually I'm giving a mandate to somebody who does not have the resources or the assets or the competencies to really handle that mandate effectively. So in that case, I should not give those responsibilities, or if I give them, I need to make sure that I develop the capacities of these people, that I make them stronger professionals. And that brings me to my last point. That is a last point here. That is a bit of a repetition of what our colleague from Singapore said this morning. He said that indeed, when you give autonomy, you always have to also ask for accountability. You give somebody a certain level of responsibilities. In exchange, that person has to demonstrate that they use those responsibilities correctly. And that's correct. Autonomy and accountability need to be together. But at the same time, there is a third factor that is important, that is professionalism. If somebody is a strong professional, and a strong professional, what does that mean? That I have the qualifications required, that I have the skills required, that I have the support I need, that I have the real professional profile, and I'm well appreciated because of my professional skills. In such a case, because I'm a strong professional, I can accept more autonomy. And in exchange, I will demonstrate that I use that autonomy effectively. I will demonstrate my accountability.
In many universities, this is of course the case. In many universities, we consider that university professors, that they are real professionals, and therefore they will have a lot of autonomy, and in exchange we can ask them to demonstrate their competence. In the education, in basic and secondary education, that is maybe not yet the case. Or maybe even we may want to give responsibilities to the wilayas, but maybe in the wilayas the people we encounter are not yet real professionals. And we still need to develop their professionalism. In order to get this balance, the state will play an effective role, will play an important role. And here I've highlighted 4 key areas, but on which I commented already, so I do not need to repeat much of this. I've already commented on how important it is to develop capacities, to have a good monitoring and evaluation framework, to keep in mind always when we give mandates to people that we need to take into account what are their resources. And finally, we need to focus always, and that brings me to the point that you had raised earlier, the point of equity. We always need to focus on strengthening those who are weak, either weak in schools or weak in the society. We need to make sure that when we decentralize, that we do not decentralize only to the strong people already, who will benefit from it much more than the weak, and which would lead to more disparities. So we need to make sure that we really focus on strengthening those actors who are the weakest actors. That would mean focusing on the teachers who are most in need of our support, focusing maybe on the schools who are most in need of our support, but focusing maybe also on the groups within society who have at the moment very little authority. Some parents who are among the poorest and so on. Yes. Okay. Now, yeah. So the state has to ensure that a number of key aspects are taken care of. The first point, some of you had mentioned that already, I think you mentioned that, is the importance also of making sure that there is a consensus around the clear policy. And that is not always easy. A consensus that everybody agrees, or if maybe not agrees, at least accepts the policy and ownership, that people feel that this is a policy that indeed they feel at ease with, and that they feel is the policy, is the right policy. You will never get 100% agreement in no society. That simply doesn't exist. But at least people must have the feeling that, okay, this policy indeed reflects what is partly our thinking. They need to focus on capacity development, evaluating and demanding performance. A final point that I want to look at is that actually the slide, I forgot to take out some of the French in there, but that's not that important. This slide actually is based on a study which McKinsey, the famous office of McKinsey, did just a few months ago. A very good study called How the World's, if you just go back one slide, there. How the world's most improved school systems keep getting better. I can send you the linkage. It's really a very interesting study and extremely well written. And what they did, McKinsey, they looked at some 20 improving systems in the world, including Singapore, but also systems which improved from a very low level. And they actually divided those school systems into 4 groups. Some systems start from a poor level and have become fair. Other systems are now fair and have become good. A third group were good and have become great. And a fourth group were systems who were great and have now become excellent. So they are all improving, but they improve from different levels. They took, for instance, Chile as an example of a system that went from fair to good. Singapore is an example of a system that went from great to excellent. Then they looked at some US states who went from good to great. and so on. And they show that there are a number of strategies that all those systems implement. I've highlighted some of those also. Consistent school support, professional development of teachers, and so on. At the same time, they show, yeah, let's leave it there for a second. At the same time, they show how the strategies that those systems implement actually change in function of their level of progress. I want to make sure I explain that clearly because it's not that evident. Let's go to the previous one. Sorry. Let's keep this one for a second. Here, no. Yeah, thanks. For instance, in all systems, teacher professional development is very important. And that is also something that our Singapore colleague demonstrated. You cannot have a system which is better than your teachers, which is evident. If you don't have good teachers, the teachers are finally the ones who are in the classroom. That is where education takes place. Education does not take place as such in a ministry or in a district office or in an international organization like mine. Education takes place in the classroom. So teacher professional development is very important. But teacher professional development can be done in different ways. They make a distinction between three approaches. One is strengthening technical skills through training, through in-service training. The second approach is to work with coaches, which are like school supervisors. School supervisors who go to schools and really work like coaches or mentors or teacher guides. And a third way of strengthening teacher professionalism is by doing more collaboration between teachers, peer collaboration. Let teachers learn from each other. And what is interesting here is that actually, when your system is not yet very good, when I work in an education system which is not yet very good, I cannot ask for teachers to teach each other because they're simply not good enough. You cannot have peer collaboration because the teachers are simply not good enough. They would teach each other bad things. In such a system, you need a lot of technical training, a lot of frameworks, a lot of relatively strict guidance. You don't have much teacher autonomy. You make sure simply that they have very clear lesson plans, that they have very clear structures, and you do a bit of coaching. That is in a system that is not yet very good, or maybe in schools that are not yet very good. Now, the more you move, the better your system becomes, the more you can rely on peer collaboration. And the less you need this sort of technical structures and technical guidance. Because now your teachers are already very good. If I'm a good teacher, I do not know... I need to stop. If I'm a good teacher, if I'm a good teacher, I do not need to develop my lesson plan every morning. It's in my head. If I'm not such a good teacher, then I will need to do that every month. So with that, I will stop. The main message is that in order to decentralize, you need to take into account a few key issues. Strong monitoring, strong support, linking support, monitoring to accountability. But the way you will do that will change a bit from school to school, probably from district to district. Okay? I will stop here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. أيضا معنا الأستاذ الدكتور محمد السعد الآن. محمد السعد جمعنا كثير من الملاحظات. إذا كان في أسئلة برضو ممكن نجمعها. الأهم من هذه الورشة ويعني الاستفادة إن شاء الله تحققت، ونتمنى إن شاء الله إن كل ما توصلنا إليه منه معرفة وخبرة جديدة أن نقدر ننقلها إن شاء الله لزملائنا وفي تطبيقاتنا وفي عملنا. الآن سعادة الدكتور نايف الرومي رئيس اللجنة المنظمة وكيل وزارة التربية والتعليم للتخطيط والتطوير يقدم هدية تذكارية للدكتور أنتوني ويشكره حقيقة على هذا على العرض الرائع.
Just to remember this
I will remember with much pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
شكرا. اوكي ثانك يو فيري ماتش، وشكرا للاخوات، شكرا للاخوان، ونعتذر عن اي تاخير طرا، ونعتذر ايضا عن المشكلات اللي صارت فنيه. اللي امل منكم حقيقه بالنسبه للاخوان والاخوات اذا في اي ملاحظات او اي نقاط تزود بالدكتور دكتور محمد السعد، وشكرا لكم.